Yeah, so as Melba linked, don't forget to sign in, and if anybody has additional agenda items, feel free to add them to the agenda. And I guess we'll give it a couple of minutes for some more folks to join.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
I'm just loading up the meeting minutes, notes. Okay, looks like a fairly light agenda today. I guess I'll go ahead and get things started if nobody else is volunteered already to run the meeting before I arrived.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So, yeah, okay, welcome everyone to the monthly SLSA community meeting. Just so you know, this meeting is being recorded and we will abide by the Linux Foundation's Code of Conduct during the meeting. If you haven't already, please add your name to the attendees list in the notes. And we'd like to start the meeting by welcoming new members. So if there's anyone who hasn't attended before and would like to kind of introduce themselves, please feel free to go ahead now.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chad with GitHub Actions. GitHub has some attendance to these meetings, I understand before, but this is my first time coming into any of it. Coming up from a bunch of different things in the company and now focusing on supply chain security. And so interested to see what's going on.
Cool. Welcome, Chad. Anyone else? Okay, cool. So next step in the meeting, we normally do a brief round of updates from the different teams working on SLSA. So we have several meetings and kind of working groups where the first one is the specification, the folks working on the core spec, then there's the positioning group, which is actually operating kind of at the next tier up in the organizational hierarchy of the OpenSSF for the supply chain integrity working group, but they still come here and tell us all the cool stuff they've been doing. And also we have the tooling team who are working on implementations of SLSA. So from the spec, things have been kind of fairly quiet since the 1.0 release. We're kind of we had a flurry of feedback initially, and now we are hoping to see some implementations and get some kind of implementation feedback, but we haven't been doing a lot of directional work on the spec. There's a proposal from Tianyu at Google to move to change the way we kind of manage the project in terms of like the generated spec, how that gets published, and also like the Git operations and how we perform kind of revision control of the spec, because at the moment we have multiple redundant copies of the spec for each version that we've released, and we want to move over to something branch based. There was some discussion in the meeting this week about how we've ended up in a situation where the specification itself and some of the files we embed in it, we embed kind of some Q and protobuf files in there to demonstrate the schema of the provenance format, and we used incorrect annotation that doesn't conform to the in toto specification in one of those files, the Q file, and so that created some ambiguity in the spec because we're not clear about what is the canonical kind of description of the data formats, and so we had a really good discussion about that and what remediating steps we should take and how we should handle versioning of a new version of the spec that fixes that. And as far as I'm aware, I haven't had a chance to look at GitHub today, but as far as I'm aware, that work hasn't happened yet. But ultimately, we will release a new minor version of the spec to bump the provenance format so that we correctly annotating that field, which is the annotations field in a resource descriptor. So that was fairly detailed. I think that's it from the spec side, though. Mike or Trishank might have something else to add. Regular attendees of the meeting as well.
Yeah, so I know that there's a lot of debate on exactly what are some of the next things we'll be working on from the perspective of like the various tracks. We're still looking for that as well. So if folks are interested, feel free to sort of open up a GitHub issue on that, because we're definitely interested to see what are the things that folks really want to focus on, because there's been a lot of discussion about a source track, a lot of discussion about bringing back something like a SLSA level 4 with specifically trying to make certain definitions clearer, because one of the reasons why we had, for folks who are new, one of the reasons why we removed SLSA level 4 from SLSA build level 4 from V1 was not because we wanted to make things less secure or to some folks have opined that it's, you know, to satisfy folks who are selling products or whatever that can't hit those things. They're like, no, it's just because nobody could agree on what really some of the definitions were, and a lot of folks were getting very confused by what was meant by hermeticity and what was meant by some of these other things. So we decided to take a step back first. And so there's interest there as well. There's also, there was some interest around two other things. One was around maybe being a bit more specific, whether either in the build track or as a separate track as something like build infrastructure. So for folks who are like, hey, what would it, even though, you know, the specification doesn't really make, have a lot of details on how you should be securing your build, your build control plane. It just says you should have a trusted build control plane. But what, you know, folks are asking, like, how do I know that should be trusted? What are the things I could do to secure that? So there's something around perhaps a build infrastructure track. And then there was folks who were saying, hey, right now the build track is very much focused on provenance, which in our blog articles and so on, we have a lot of stuff around, what's the word? None of the stuff in the build provenance track really talks about the build itself. So SLSA can definitely still build malware. The problem is, the thing that SLSA really gives you is, you know that, right? Like you have the details of how it was built. You have the details of how it came to be. So you can't have somebody have lied to you about how it got built. No, it actually got built inside of your build system. And then while also sort of eliminating a lot of the ways that somebody would potentially break future builds, stuff like that. So that's really where the core of a lot of the SLSA stuff is. And so folks have been asking like, hey, what are things from the end user side that perhaps you should look at when running a build and stuff like that? And does that belong in the same track and that sort of thing? So there's some debates about those things. There's actually a lot of GitHub issues under the SLSA GitHub, and feel free to kind of take a look at some of those.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, the notion of terminology has come up a few times in the last few weeks, as you mentioned, and I think we're trending towards like just being very explicit about what we mean instead of using terms that we increasingly recognize both within SLSA and then in the broader supply chain effort. Is like a lot of these words carry a lot of context for people with different backgrounds, so maybe we should just avoid them. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was gonna say, I think, yeah, either avoid them or make sure that we have a glossary and specifically call out our definitions of those terms. Because I know, as an example, you know, one of the things that's been brought up a couple of times, right, is if you're in the compliance world, attestation means one thing. If you're in the software world, your attestation can mean another thing. If you're in the hardware world, attestation means something specific. And so there's a lot of elements there, and especially when, in our case, we're sort of combining all three of those at some level, it can cause folks to get very confused.
Yeah, I think that's for me, that's the key example of why we should steer away from defining terms and just avoiding using them, because we've got a fairly comprehensive discussion of what we mean by an attestation, but that is still frequently something that comes up because the term is, if you come from like a TPM-ish trusted hardware background, attestation means a very specific thing, and it doesn't matter how many words you write about what you think it means, it will always mean that thing to the people with that background. So yeah, cool, thank you. Can someone from the positioning group summarize what you've been doing? I think we've got most of the folks there.
Yeah, so I know Jay and Bruno and Mike have probably been doing most of the work while I've been absent. For some of the things recently in terms of deliverables, we were able to, at a higher level, right, there's a new blog for SLSA, Fresca, S2C2F on the OpenSSF's website, right? It's just talking about the supply chain integrity working group, you know, what it's about. We talk about the SLSA 1.0 release, and, you know, how we encourage people to come and join and help us. There has been a new meeting, the Sterling Toolchain meeting, which I gave Rob a hard time. I say, Rob, you're killing me. I've been having really good participation, and then you put this this meeting on the calendar. So that meeting is now conflicting with the positioning meeting. So there's been light attendance as a result. So I need to create a new poll for new meeting times to move the positioning meeting. There's still some pending blog drafts that we haven't been able to get out, probably due mainly to me being out. And then I know Jay is working on a one-pager blog for guidance. Mike, Jay, Bruno, do you want to add anything else?
No, that pretty much covers it. Yeah, that pretty much covers. I can't think of anything else that we do have a list of potential blogs that or things that we're thinking about from the positioning side that we want to talk about, and of course a lot of it really does depend on what comes out of meetings like this and the spec meeting and everything else, so that we're talking with the right voice as we continue to speak about, you know, what we're doing SLSA related. So, but other than that, I mean, you know, Melba did a good job of depicting everything we have going on right now.
Yeah, agree on that one. And I think the only thing I want to just add in there as something that's come up, I think the past maybe month or two is just as Salsa has begun to grow, there definitely seems to be some like areas outside of, let's say, the cybersecurity sort of area where folks are either just hearing a Salsa or haven't heard a Salsa yet. That there might be some areas for us to, and we're interested in hearing from other folks as well, as like, where do folks want to see us focus our efforts, not just on the Salsa side, but just generally for the supply chain, because I know the positioning group is part of the higher level supply chain integrity group of, hey, with some of the stuff that we're doing from supply chain, one of the things we could probably also focus on a bit more is talk a bit more about supply chain integrity. I've given a couple of just talks recently on Salsa at a couple of smaller sorts of DevOps sort of related events, and maybe only about 10% of the audience had even heard of supply chain security, let alone Salsa, which was maybe only 1 or 2 people had heard of Salsa before. So I think there's a lot of areas where we can maybe help spread the word a little bit, because we might be so, some of us might be in a cybersecurity bubble, in sort of a security space bubble.
Cool, thanks, Mike. Can you, while you're on, do you want to talk about the tooling?
Sure.
Thanks.
Sure. So a couple things. So one, I think the biggest one, and I know I put some stuff in the notes there. So one of the biggest ones, there's some interest in salsifying Jenkins. So like, what are the things that, a lot of folks are like, hey, it's great that there's all this stuff coming out from GitHub Actions and from stuff like Fresca for that uses Tecton and Tecton chains and all that good stuff. And there's a couple other, things that people are looking at, but the elephant in the room is still Jenkins. Like, hey, a lot of folks are still using Jenkins. What are the things people could do to potentially do best practices on there? And I think that I have created a document. I linked it in the meeting notes. There seemed to be some interest. I haven't really worked with Jenkins, and I'm happy I haven't worked with Jenkins. No offense, for at least the past few years. So I'm not probably the best person to sort of lead that sort of thing. So if there's folks out there who are interested in contributing to that document and helping lead it up, I'm definitely willing to contribute, especially from the perspective of, hey, here's generally how Salsa works, and here's some of the things that like I could poke around with, but I'm not a Jenkins expert, at least anymore. And so if folks are interested on that side, please take a look at that as well. And so that's salsifying Jenkins. Also, generally, I think we're looking for more Salsa tool developers to help join the meeting. I believe a few folks have begun to do an APAC-friendly time zone meeting on Salsa, because there's actually a couple of folks over from Japan, Australia, Singapore, who are starting to actually write up some interesting Salsa stuff. And in particular, I know there's the Oracle team. They announced a tool called Macaron, which is in the Slack chat. I don't have the links off the top of my head, but it's a tool that can help generate reports and do Salsa verification. Looks pretty cool. In addition to that, we also want to have more participation from end users. So folks who are like, hey, I plan to consume these things. I want to generate Salsa, or I want to consume Salsa, but I'm doing X and I can't use GitHub Actions, or I'm doing, or I'm trying to consume the Salsa attestations from GitHub Actions. And what do I do with this attestation? I think that sort of thing would be useful. We're looking for more participation there. And for folks who aren't aware of the meeting, it happens at 10 a.m. Eastern time right now. There is a separate meeting that I'm not exactly sure how often it happens. That's in APAC time zone, and there's some debate on there's some stuff there. So that's those two things. People have also been asking about Salsa v1 provenance, because right now it looks like I think all the tools have only really done Salsa v0.2. A few tools have begun to do the work to be Salsa v1, to generate Salsa v1, but none of it is there yet. And just as for folks who are I know that's still confusing for a lot of people, but you can be Salsa V1. You could still be doing Salsa V1 without generating Salsa V1 specification. The Salsa V1 specification is just a better way of, and that itself is its own can of worms right now. And then separately, one of the things that I've been working on, and it's open source, is I've been working on a tool called Spectre. Spectre is a tool written in Rust to validate stuff like Salsa documents and other in-toto attestations and SBOMs. And it tries to do so by being very, very strict. So it's all written in Rust, and it uses, it tries to be very, very strict. So if something is not just purely a string, it is a base64 encoded string, or it's a URL, it actually tries to be very, very strict. And if it doesn't actually match the semantics from the spec, it will try to fail the thing. Because one of the things is a lot of folks who are trying to consume Salsa is all it takes is something to generate something that looks like valid Salsa, and it breaks everything. So there's some stuff on that end. We're doing I'm doing a bunch of work on that. It could be used as a library in Rust. It also can be used to generate. I'm building out a couple of features to help it generate fake Salsa metadata for folks who want to test out their own tools in Salsa. It can also be used to one of the things that I'm working on is to also translate some of the data between different specifications. So, hey, I can pull information that came out of an SBOM, injected into a Salsa attestation, or vice versa, stuff like that.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks for the updates, everyone. I should have asked if there were any questions after each update, really, shouldn't I? That was a rookie mistake. Does anyone have any questions about any of those updates? That would be a good time to ask. The agenda's pretty light. Failing that, does anyone have any topics they would like to just in time add to the agenda?
If folks don't mind, I know many were out during the last meeting, and I see a topic that was presented by Bruno. So I don't know if Bruno's willing to give an update on the steering committee process.
Yeah, let me bring here the link to the election process that you have been discussing. I think that everybody has access. But we didn't have a lot of discussion since the last time, and we have been two fundamentals decisions. One is the number of steering committee members that will be elected every period. And the another one is who is qualified to vote. I think that it's we have to take a decision on those two major topics so we can move forward. As I sent the link, I hope that you can join as well. Put your thoughts on it. That's what we're stuck for now.
If I remember correctly, the question around how many committee members to elect wasn't necessarily about increasing or reducing the size of the committee, but was more about how do we even need to worry about there being overlapping terms between the current committee and the next committee. And so if we were to, for example, try and elect half of the committee each election cycle, how would we do that without arbitrarily culling members from the current committee? So
sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, as of today, I think that it's we're toward the point that it's maybe we are going to re-elect the whole steering committee plus a number of new candidates to go to everybody at once to the election. That's what I'm seeing moving toward at this point. But of course, we have all agree.
Topic. Okay, Mike, you've had your hand up first.
Sure. So I think one of the things that might be worthwhile to also go over for folks who might be considering something like the steering committee is maybe to just also, I think it's been since we haven't actually used a whole lot of like, in our governance, right, we do say that like the steering committee gets to vote on sort of overriding certain things, or pushing forward certain things. I think it'd be worthwhile to kind of also maybe highlight like what are sort of the responsibilities as well as powers that the steering committee has, so that folks know like other than just sort of saying, yeah, I'm a normal I'm a big contributor to SLSA. What else does that mean?
Yeah, that's a fair point. There's a certain amount documented in the governance repository already, but I think one of the reasons why people are uncertain about what the steering committee does is because they haven't necessarily needed to do much in the governance of the project so far. But I think, yeah, I would have to reread the governance docs, but I think per the governance docs, some of the stuff the steering committee does is arranging meetings like this and kind of handling the broader projects outside of the specific working groups that we have. Melba, do you have comment?
Yeah, I had a question about, how big the steering committee should be relative to the community, right? A lot of times, the people that actually participate and are active, they are on the steering committee. And then there's, maybe one or two that kind of come in and out. So if everyone's on the steering committee that is participating, that kind of negates the point. Obviously I'm not trying to shrink the committee in any way, shape, or form, but just trying to think about that ratio, like what good does a steering committee do if the people on the steering committee are the only ones contributing? I know that's not the case today, right? Because there are some people on the steering committee that we haven't seen in a while. But it's something to consider of how big is too big, given the size of the community.
Yeah, that's a fair question. I don't know how we resolve that, honestly. Like, I think some of the ambiguity is that the original steering committee was both the steering committee function as defined in the governance documents, but also some of the indication of the industry consensus behind the project. But as the project has grown, we've seen very active participation from people outside of the steering committee that frankly better indicates that the industry is behind this as the standard than having 7 people from different companies on the steering committee does. The participation and adoption is larger than that. So I think part of, yeah, it's a great question. If anyone has any thoughts on how we answer that, whether we need to answer that before we do the next election cycle, things like that, please go.
Yeah, because I think that doesn't the TAC or the governing board for OpenSSF have a similar model, right? Based off of the number of people in the organization, there might be a need for a new seat or something. I think there's some concept like that, if I'm not mistaken.
What would be the ideal ratio? It's a good idea.
So Arno, you're on the TAC now, so I don't know if you know
the TAC
answer
does
to
not
that.
have the TAC doesn't have a rule like this. There's been discussions at the governing board level to increase the size of the TAC. It has not happened, at least to date. There is definitely no automatic rule that says, oh, as the community grows, we increase the size of the TAC. That's for sure. But if I may, I mean, so I've been involved in this SLSA space for quite a while now. And, thing that I find a bit weird is that we basically don't see what the steering committee does. And maybe it comes down to what was said earlier, that it hasn't done much, which maybe is a good thing because there was no real issues. They felt like, well, but I think, you know, we ought to be a bit more transparent. And I don't know who would run. I don't know what they would sign up for. I mean, you know, if you look at the TAC, for instance, which is a big part of the governance structure in OpenSSF, it's fully transparent, right? It has meetings that are minuted and all that. You know when the calls are, you can attend them. I don't think anything like this is happening with the steering committee that I know of. So I think we need to fix this.
So I can speak, like, I agree the steering committee should be transparent. I should state that the reason there are no public meetings is because there are no meetings. It's not because the steering committee is not transparent. It's just because it's not very active. And so I can completely understand why that might lead people to think that things are happening behind closed doors when they really aren't. Yeah, I think it would be great to encourage people who want to run to be in part of the steering committee to think about this, like transparency and how active the steering committee may need to be, what they could be doing outside of like reactive, responsive things that we haven't really had to do much of so far. But I think is a really legitimate concern, and welcome some new ideas around that. As we've kind of intimated, but I was just stating explicitly, like the active members of the steering committee are people who are active in the broader project, and so it can be difficult to draw a line between what steering committee members are doing versus active contributors to the project, because they tend to be the same people. I also wanted to just quickly comment on, Arno, I think you mentioned that there has been a suggestion from the OpenSSF GB about increasing the size of the TAC. Is that like, is the impetus for that proportional representation of kind of the OpenSSF membership, or is it a better representation of maybe the governing board? Because I know I think the governing board has grown, but the TAC hasn't.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, governing board, I mean, it's a matter of your level of membership in OpenSSF. If you're a premium member, you get a seat on the board. That's all it takes. So it will grow as the number of premium members grows. But when it comes to the TAC size, I mean, you know, to be fair, I think there have been people pushing back on the idea. Typically, the argument that I'm aware of are in favor of increasing has to do with having better representation of everything that goes on within OpenSSF, all the different groups and members, and increasing diversity, if you will. And the cons is concerns that it may become a body that has hard time reaching consensus, because the more people, the more voices you get, the harder possibly it is to get to a decision. I mean, I actually think this is mostly a falsehood, you know, but that becomes more of an opinion. I'm not stating a fact. This is like, you know, others will have different opinions on that.
Sure. Cool. Thanks. Mike, I think you're next in the queue.
Yeah. So yeah, wanted to provide also like maybe 2 sentences of background, I think, like, which was in, I think it was like the first or second one of these meetings. It was just like, hey, we should probably have some sort of steering committee, and I'm pretty sure all the folks who were on the call end up just on the steering committee just by default, because we were all the only folks who were participating. So the at some level, the SLSA community meeting was at first just the folks who were doing all that, who were like very much involved. And I think, you know, with an understanding that we wanted to make sure that the folks who were showing up to these meetings got a bit of a bigger say, because one of the things that is still fairly common, right, in any open source meeting is since all these meetings are open, it's very easy for somebody to, let's say, just come in once every 3-4 months and potentially derail stuff by like, even if they're well-meaning, it's like, hey, we need to make sure that the folks who are contributing somewhat get a bigger say on it. So that was kind of, I think, some of the background there. But I do think that now that we've grown and, it's not just the 7 members on the steering committee showing up, it's, we have dozens of folks within opening issues and joining these meetings and joining the specification meeting, the positioning meeting, the tooling meeting. It's probably worthwhile to maybe clarify what the SLSA steering committee is intended for, because I think we've only ever really had to vote on a handful of things throughout this entire process, and it's always been like just a topic in one of these meetings to begin with. But yeah, if we do grow, I can anticipate us needing to have a SLSA steering committee meeting.
Thanks. Trishan.
Yeah, those are all very valid points. Thanks. And thanks for raising this question. It's very important to discuss them as a community. I can vouch that there's certainly no secret meetings that we're having. So that fact is true. I agree that, so I think partly to answer Bruno's questions and Melba's questions too, is that maybe this is what we need to decide before we solidify the election process, is to clarify what we expect from the next steering committee. I think that's important to really, before we hold an election at all. So.
Cool. It sounds like there's fairly broad consensus on that in the chat. We had some good suggestions around like what we would want, what properties we would want from the steering committee with transparency and being active and things. And I think for the most part, the current steering committee are very active participants in the community. Like we have all but 2 of them on this call, and one of those 2 is very active in the project. Otherwise, but I think maybe I've certainly wondered if there's a better distinction to be drawn between steering committee members and people involved in the project on a sort of daily basis. So does I guess the obvious question is do we have any volunteers to kind of drive forward this definition based on what we have in the current governance document?
So I don't want to volunteer on this. I have too much going on right now. But actually, one question I did want to bring up is I think it's probably worthwhile just and Arno, you might have the info here of like when we originally created the SLSA steering committee, whatever it was it 2 years ago, something like that. We the governance for the OpenSSF was also not fully solidified either. So we also want to make sure that whatever we end up doing with the SLSA steering committee doesn't somehow contradict something that's like a core piece of the OpenSSF's governance now that it's been a bit more solidified either.
Yeah, so I can answer that there is no rules there, so we're pretty much free to do what we want. There is the point of, like if we have an election, who gets to vote is actually a broader issue, which doesn't pertain only to the election of the steering committee, right? We have seen it in other working groups where, an issue comes up, there's a proposal made to create a project, to adopt a project or something like this, and there's a formal vote that takes place, but this is very well undefined. This is really not well defined, and there's the question of, well, who gets to vote, right? And so this is a problem I think OpenSSF, the TAC, wants to tackle. and this is probably something I would expect we'll come up with some rule and that will be, you know, broadly applicable to everybody. But that's about it for now. And when it comes to the actual steering committee, it's up to every working group to define what they do. And until that changes and the TAC says, no, we're going to put some standard steering committee governance structure that everybody has to follow, I think here we can do what we want.
Melba.
Would it be worthwhile to go through the current definition for folks on the call and just go through, do we still agree with what's written? Not sure if that's valuable for people or not.
Yeah, I mean, if you'd like to do that, if anyone has a strong opinion either way, make it known, please. We can certainly spend a few minutes doing that.
Yeah, I have it open. There's only like 4 points on the steering committee, it seems, but maybe I'm misreading it.
Yeah.
So if I may interject, one thing is, you know, there is what's in the text and there is what you guys have done, whatever it is. And, you know, for that matter, I don't think we necessarily need the steering committee to have actual meetings. I definitely, you know, I wouldn't be pushing for this, but there's got to have been some communication. And I think it would be good for the existing steering committee to have a look at the text and see whether it captures at least what's being done that has been necessary, you know, what you guys have had to do, and whether this is useful, and if it's actually captured in there. And if there are things that you say, well, based on our experience, this is irrelevant, we should drop that. I think that would be a good first thing to do.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the one thing I wanted to actually highlight was I'm pretty sure the only thing the steering committee has done above and beyond just what general, like the folks who've been contributing a bunch, is just that last point, the making decisions when community consensus cannot be reached, which I think we've only ever had to do a couple of times where we saw that there was a contentious issue about the definition of something, and the steering committee kind of came in and said, yep, this seems like the most reasonable solution, and we voted on it. And I think that also only happened a handful of times.
Because see, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that I meant by transparency. We should have a clear record of when this takes place, right? And there may be some record somewhere that I don't know. I'm not saying you guys never, but
yeah. So on that end, I will say, and maybe we just make it clearer. I agree with you. The only time that's ever happened is we took the vote and recorded it in a GitHub issue or inside of the Google Doc. So we always recorded it somewhere. And I think, but I think making that clearer to your point is so that folks know where to look for records of those votes, as opposed to go fishing for it is really important.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, the voting has all been done on GitHub, and there just haven't been many of them, and there's multiple GitHub repositories involved at this point. Like I'm looking at the list here and seeing like collectively reviewing and revising the roadmap on a biannual basis. I mean, we have collectively reviewed and revised the roadmap, but it hasn't been on a biannual basis because we've not delivered what we set out in the previous roadmap in that kind of initial projection of time chunking. So sorry, Trishank, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. So how about this? And I'm not saying that this is the best proposal, but I'm curious to hear what others think. How about we do this? I think the onus is on the current steering committee members right now to meet and discuss what we expect the next steering committee to do. And of course, we're going to be transparent about this. We're going to discuss this. Maybe there's a volunteer or two writing a doc together, and then we pitch it to the next SLSA monthly meeting or the one after that. But the point is we present something. What do others think?
Hanno, go ahead.
Yeah, by the way, it's a provocative statement, but a proposal, but you could also entertain the idea of not having a steering committee. If it's not, we could rely on having, well, we have people who are involved and this is the community that's making those decisions. Do you actually need a steering committee? My experience, and I'll be open about this, is like, companies, when they go open collaboration style, they fear they're going to lose control. But the reality is the control is within in the hands of the people who are actively engaged. If you actively engage, you have at least some amount of control, and you don't need to have special powers in a steering committee that says, well, it doesn't matter if it doesn't go the way we want at the steering committee, we can always shift things the way we want. So I'm just, there may be valid reasons, but if you guys felt like, well, we haven't had much to do, maybe we don't need it. That should be at least in people's mind.
Yeah. So yeah, I think I agree with that as well. And I think it's probably worth discussing through. I think not necessarily a counterpoint to what you said, but something that I think is still valuable either way. And it's kind of slightly tangential. Is I know that a lot of different like growing and very large open source projects have the concept of either leads or some sort of badge or something like that especially for folks who are growing engineers or growing contributors in open source, so that they can kind of say, hey, I'm a such and such on Salsa. I'm a lead on the such and such track for Salsa. And it's something that I know helps a lot of folks, and it helps provide incentive for a lot of folks who do a lot of that contribution from like a contributor letter standpoint. So, it helps them in their careers and a lot of their personal growth as well, which once again, it's slightly tangential to the steering committee thing, but I do think that at least some level of like providing, more of that incentive, even if it's just a badge of honor for some folks, is something that I know some people appreciate as a way of like seeing that their contributions are well known or whatever.
Yeah, so I wrote it in the chat, but that's the notion of a contributor ladder, I think. And as I understand it, there's been a proposal to have kind of a high level one in the OpenSSF for projects to adopt as they see fit. I haven't reviewed it personally, but I think it would be worthwhile for us to look at that and see how we can foster our contributors. Arno.
Yeah, I don't mean
I think
to,
Melba's next.
I don't mean to monopolize the microphone, so tell me when you want to move on. But, what Mike just said is very relevant. I mean, I think it is true that people need to get recognition, and it's often helpful to justify the time they spend to their employer on an activity like this. So I'm familiar with this, and I acknowledge it. But in fact, we have another level of control, right, which is the maintainer status. And so in a sense, when we talk about, what if there's a big issue? Well, the maintainers have more control than Lambda contributors. And so that should be fully documented who the maintainers are. And maybe that's enough. We don't need a steering committee on top of the maintainers. The maintainers could be the virtual steering committee kind of thing. Just an idea.
Yeah, I think we even have an issue for that in the governance repository, that we need to better document who our maintainers are, because the kind of the moniker of a maintainer is, in most open source projects, is the people who review and merge code. But in Salsa and other communities, we have a lot more leadership roles that kind of fit the responsibilities and the recognition of being a maintainer without necessarily doing that kind of review and hands-on Git surgery. So that would be, I agree, it would be super useful. I think I even filed the issue. It would be better to document that stuff. Melba, you have a hand raised.
Yeah, I can't raise my hand when I'm sharing the screen. So I had a question along the lines of the maintainers, right? Because reading this, I might be reading it wrong. It seems like a maintainer cannot be, or steering committee member cannot be a maintainer. I could be reading that wrong. And if that's the case, then I think we will have to take a look at, okay, who are the maintainers versus steering committee members? Because steering committee seems more leadership, right? Less, hands-on PRs, right? Yes, I can do it, but that's the way it seems, right? There's contributors, and then there's the leaders of the contributors, and then there's the leaders of the maintainers that are the leaders of the contributors, right? So it seems almost like a hierarchy. And so I would expect that the steering committee members are less less day-to-day and more on I don't want to say operations. That's not quite the right word I'm looking for, but yeah, I'm not sure what word I'm looking for.
I think you got it with strategy and strategic.
There you go. There you go.
I mean, my read of the governance docs and the governance docs were instigated or were formalized kind of after this was already true, but I don't read that maintainers can't be part of the steering committee, only that they cannot be involved in a vote by the steering committee when it affects their maintainer status.
Got it. Okay.
But I mean, there's been some really interesting discussion that reflects like the growth of the community and the diversification of roles within the community and the different types of leadership we have. And maybe we don't need a steering committee. Maybe we just need to better like document and recognize the different leadership roles in the community, and that larger set of leaders with diverse representation and skills could be sufficient to replace the steering committee concept. Really interesting questions. I think we've had a bunch of great discussion. I'm conscious of the fact that we've only got a few minutes left, and we don't have a I don't think we have a direct plan of action for next steps. So I think we should focus on that. Like I know Trishank suggested maybe the steering committee that exists today should kind of take ownership of this definition. I don't oppose that idea. I'm curious if anyone else has any strong thoughts on ways forward, or Trishank, if you're volunteering to shepherd that effort.
I guess I accidentally volunteered myself, and yeah, I'll do it. So.
If
Sounds
I may,
good.
I mean, Trishank, you actually raised the six-store case, which is indeed the case where they have a steering committee. But I think they have a situation that actually makes a lot of sense for me to have a steering committee, because they have, in fact, I mean, as I think most people here should know, six-store is not one project, it's really three different projects. And so you cannot have maintainers across all these projects, so they actually need some kind of body that does the coordination of across all these different projects, and the steering committee fits well that role. I don't know that we have that for SLSA, but I'm not against the steering committee. I'm not trying to kill it. Don't get me wrong. I think if there is some value to it, let's keep it. But we should better define it. So Trishank, thank you for volunteering.
One thing I want to just throw out there, because I think this was also one of the original reasons why we had discussed something like a steering committee, was less about that because we've seen this in other open source projects a little bit, is we didn't want to have what had to have happen is, and it's part of the who's allowed to vote problem. We didn't want to have a half dozen people from one company all start joining a couple of the meetings and trying to vote just purely their agenda in. We wanted to say, hey, here's a bunch of members. They all sort of largely agree on the general charter of what SLSA is trying to do. And, you know, we might disagree on some things, but it's not like we're just going to throw a million people from company X and be like, yeah, now Salsa's this, and this is how we're pushing it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think we've talked about a few things like how do we handle when people aren't as active as they once were, but I think we need to be wary of requiring weekly attendance of meetings or even weekly engagement in the project. Like, we want community participants to be active if they have these leadership roles, but for people who have jobs which aren't just working on SLSA, then we need to be forgiving of other priorities as well. So there's definitely a balancing act there. Okay, cool. Lots of great discussion. Thanks everyone, and thanks Trishank for volunteering to take this forward. Yeah, I will happily contribute, collaborate on that, and I'll see it when you share it with the broader community. So yeah, thanks everyone for your time today and for the good discussion. See you in the next meeting in a month's time.
Thanks, Ciao.